tonight, America's thriving colonies are heavily dependent on slave labor.
Slavery was an extraordinary goose that laid the golden egg.
The war for independence brings the enslaved new hope.
For them, the revolution really was a freedom struggle.
Is liberty in the air?
The country that says to the world we bring ourselves into existence on the principle of human freedom is founded on slavery.
For 100 years, the enslaved had been trapped in a brutal system. Resistance was always dangerous. At the outbreak of the American Revolution, liberty was in the air. But black people, both enslaved and free, learned that for their voices to be heard, they would have to ignite their own freedom struggle. New York City, 1741. Quack, enslaved to a house painter, approached Fort George, the seat of British colonial rule in New York, and home to the governor.
Quack was married to the governor's cook, a slave. The governor did not like Quack's behavior and did not like when Quack came visiting. And the governor gave orders to the fort sentries that if Quack should appear, he should not be allowed entry. Quack uttered certain imprecations that he would burn the place down, but he would be with his wife. When the fort did subsequently burn down, Quack was a prime suspect.
When fires erupted in a number of other buildings, warehouses, and stores, it was clear that this was more than romance thwarted.
The cry went up, the Negroes are rising, the Negroes are rising.
Rumors of slaves organizing rebellion traveled the Atlantic seaboard. 2 years earlier, in an uprising of slaves in Stono, South Carolina, some whites were murdered. Now, white New Yorkers panicked.
Almost every adult black male who was over 14 years of age was picked up by the city constables, by the militia, and placed in jail.
As the inquiries began, Caesar, slave of a baker, was the first to be marched to the gallows. His body would hang in a public space, while a conspiracy trial accused dozens of slaves and a few whites of plotting to burn down New York City and foment slave rebellion. The trial revealed bitter details about the lives of the enslaved in New York, home to the second largest slave population after Charleston, South Carolina.
There was a sense among all of these slaves that they were trapped into a system that offered no yield at all, that there was nothing that they could do if they wanted to be free except to revolt.
Slaves complained about being overworked and that they weren't supplied with enough clothing or fuel to keep warm. They lashed out at the laws that prohibited them from gathering together. But their most common complaint was not being allowed to visit their loved ones.
In the mid-18th century, African Americans in New York knew that liberty existed for others. They knew it was denied to them.
As slaves faced the court, they were confronted by all the laws that had accumulated over the past 100 years, restricting and degrading their lives.
The law of slavery deemed that persons who were patently human beings were not in fact persons. They were not persons at law. Rather, they were deemed property. Well, that is a patent fiction. Anyone can look at Caesar, at Quack, and say, well, yes, these are persons. And much of slaves' existence was geared to the fact of demonstrating their humanity.
Early in the proceedings, Quack was accused of burning down Fort George. He and 12 other black men were burned at the stake. 17 were hanged. 4 whites were also hanged.
After each rebellion, what the society seeks to do is pass a more repressive set of laws. And so we have a continually upward cycling of violence, because the violence of slaveholder repression produces the violence of slave reaction.
By the 1750s, some 5,000 Africans a year were brought to American docks in crowded, filthy, stinking ships.
And for weeks, they are confined to these places. People being chained together. People dying and being chained to dead people for periods of time until somebody decides to take the dead people above decks and throw them into the ocean.
Some people didn't last 2 weeks, but for other people, they began mustering the human resources that it would take to figure out the predicament they had been thrown into. The planters, the exploiters, have rationalized what they're doing. They've worked it out with the law. They've worked it out with their God one way or another. And they've begun the long trek into American racism. That is to say, they have reduced these people to less than human beings, and that's the way they're going to make it work.
100 years after the first Africans arrived, most colonies were heavily dependent upon slave labor. By 1750, 250,000 enslaved blacks now made vast wealth possible for their masters.
Slavery, it seems to me, was an extraordinary goose that laid the golden egg. You had workers that you didn't have to pay, and you owned their children as soon as they were born. It's a preposterous system. All you have to do is visit one of the huge plantations in Virginia or South Carolina to see the wealth that flowed.
At Shadwell, a tobacco plantation in the Piedmont region of Virginia, 2 young boys are growing up together. Jupiter was born a slave. The other, Thomas Jefferson, would one day be president of a new republic. Jupiter was one of more than 60 slaves who sustained Jefferson's family.
A new generation of black people, of slaves, is coming of age. These are people who are born on this side of the Atlantic. These are people who know how to operate within the society.
When Thomas Jefferson went off to study the classics, Jupiter was trained to be Jefferson's personal valet. That training would include sophisticated lessons in psychology and power.
Certainly, as he grew up, one of the things that he was going to have to learn is that a boy who is his same age, Thomas Jefferson, is going to grow up to be his owner, is going to grow up to be his master.
He came to understand something about the politics of that world. The word liberty, of course, would come to be used much in the years that followed, and his own owner, Thomas Jefferson, became a great merchant of the language of liberty. Jupiter understood that as well.
Jupiter's status and work conditions were privileged compared to most other slaves at Shadwell. But for all of them, including Jupiter, it would be endless work from sunup to sundown and beyond.
all of them also would have experienced a punishment. The cutting off of ears, the kind of contraptions that are placed around people to prevent running away. All of these torturous weapons are realities that enslaved people everywhere would have experienced.
Jupiter, like any child, would also have to deal with the fact that while his parents have authority over him, their authority is secondary to the authority of the slave owner. He might have to witness his mother being schooled by her owner. He would have to watch his mother being punished, being whipped, or being raped.
In this lopsided balance of power, slaves found ingenious ways to resist the master. Some subtle,